Hey everybody, I'm Dan. I work at Facebook. I'm in the marketing science team. We have another one of us here, Andy, whose presentation is later, and y'all should watch it. So we focus on advertising effectiveness research, basically, to help our clients and other marketers improve on their overall ROI and get the most out of their marketing and measure it correctly. And that's us in black t-shirts. So what I want to focus on today is that everybody in this room kind of has the same problem, and it's measurement and attribution across publishers, channels, or whatever marketing you're doing. And there's lots of fancy methods that we all have for actually doing this. Something, though, that I think that a lot more people should think about doing is using techniques that we know to work to help actually calibrate the methods that we're using. So, for example, at Facebook, we have a really easy and fairly high-quality way of doing experiments on lift. Since we have basically a closed-loop solution that we have good data on our people for, we have a relatively easy time compared to different kinds of methods of actually measuring lift on our channel. So we can just take a population, cut it into test and control, show the test group some ads, and then measure the difference between the groups in sales and sort of call it a day. An example of one such study was something we ran with Acura. You can see that if you don't really do a good design for this study, most of the sales that we could actually track were the same between the two groups, but there is an incremental value in the treatment group, which we can directly attribute to Facebook because we had a good design on the test. So another key element of how we actually do our measurement is based on identity. And everybody here kind of has their own way of having an identity stack or figuring that out, and it's obviously super important. Not only just to look at different devices, but also every measurement technique can lose its people and in turn end up contaminating its groups. So for this one random e-com campaign we did a while ago, we had fairly even delivery between the two groups in terms of impressions, but people were able to convert on either kind of device. And we could see that things were mostly stable, but up to 20% of these impressions ended up converting on a different device than they originally saw the impression on. And that would be lost if you didn't have some kind of idea of identity or some way of measuring this kind of attribution. So for us, we care a lot because everybody markets everywhere, and even if you're putting a lot of money onto Facebook, that's never going to be all of your marketing spend. And so we want to just figure out how can we help advertisers compare us to their other channels and help them just do attribution better overall. So this was an Atlas campaign we did with some e-com client where they had bunches of publishers, not that much spend was on Facebook, but we have a pretty good ability to actually compare people's identity since it was served with Atlas, which can sync with Facebook identity. So you can see that if we look at this in a last touch sort of model, this is the distribution of attribution. Publisher 2 got most of the credit and got most of the spend, whereas Publisher 7 got another big bump as well. But if we actually put an MTA model on this, we can see that these distributions just change a little bit. Not a huge amount, but for example, Publisher 2 is about the same, but Publisher 7, you can see actually isn't really adding any value to the campaign. It was probably mostly retargeting on people who are going to buy anyway. But since we actually have Facebook and we have a little bit more to play with since it's our stack, if we zoom in on the Facebook attribution for this campaign, we see that if we look at it in the last touch way, 4% of the value of the campaign was because of last touch on Facebook. And if we have an MTA model, then 5% of it is attributed to us, which isn't that different. Last touch is basically fine here. But when we have an actual study on this that we have a real test and control group for, not just an observational method, we see that the true value of Facebook was closer to 7%. Now, this is actually not that different from 5%, and depending on the kind of work you're doing or depending on the kind of client, it might not be impactful for you. But the reason that this is important to us is because we can start using these measures that we think are highly accurate to help the entire model and verify our ideas about the model. So this is a comparison of different kinds of attribution schemes and how they would measure Facebook, both in a cookie way and a people way, just to compare the different approaches. And so 100% here means the true value as we measured with our Lyft product. So you can see the last click was basically just the most inaccurate. We're only really describing 20% of the value we were contributing. Whereas last touch, as long as you had a sense that the people did relatively fine, it was 70% right-ish. And the other methods only give you a little bit of an incremental value there, with even credit doing quite well and almost as well as our MTA model. But you see across the board here that if you only have cookies and no sense of identity, you're losing more than half of the value that we think that we are contributing to this campaign. And for us, this is less about kind of saying one method is better than the other, but more about saying you should always be actually measuring your measurement to make sure that it is sane. So one other thing that we did, basically, is we do this kind of stuff a lot, and so we wanted to measure for a bunch of different campaigns, how do different attribution schemes compare. So here I'm only talking about the last touch attribution against the true value of a lift study. And you can see sometimes it's right. For example, in study 1, the lift estimate is basically the same as the estimate you would get from last touch. But you just don't necessarily know until you actually verify if that's going to be true for your campaign or not. For example, in study 8 that we have down here, we can see that the direction is just completely wrong with the estimate. And this is not a novel case. And these studies were kind of picked to be all over the board, but we don't have any heavy remarketing campaigns here, which would even articulate this point even more clearly. So the real point that I'm trying to working through as an organization, and I imagine everybody is we have lots of different ways of measuring our ads, and you might not need to do that much to get a much better sense of how you're doing and how good your measurement is working. That's all I got. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.